Okay, we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Public Funds Public Schools webinar. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center and the director of Public Funds Public Schools, which was established by Education Law Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center and is directed by Education Law Center. PFPS is a national campaign to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools and are not diverted to private school vouchers or similar programs. Please visit our website, pfps.org, where you can sign up on the contacts page for updates, explore and use our resources in your own advocacy, and support us by making a donation using the button on the homepage or helping to amplify our work. And we hope to have the opportunity to support and partner with many of you in the audience. We thank you for joining us today for a highly anticipated event in the PFPS webinar series. This webinar is a conversation with the editors of the School Voucher Illusion, featuring three of the nation's foremost experts on private school vouchers and education policy to talk about their new book, The School Voucher Illusion, Exposing the Pretense of Equity, and they will be introduced to you shortly. We will also drop a link in the chat where you can purchase the book, and please use the code PFPS for a discount. There will be time for audience Q&A, and we will also record the webinar and post it on our website. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's webinar, another of our foremost experts on education policy, Janel George, who is Associate Professor of Law at Georgetown Law, where she focuses on racial stratification in public education and is the founder and director of the Racial Equity in Education Law and Policy Clinic. And we're also particularly proud that both Professor George and one of our panelists, Professor Kevin Welner, are members of the Education Law Center Board of Trustees. So Professor George, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for that introduction. And thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon for this conversation. I'm really thrilled to be able to help facilitate this conversation with, as Jessica noted, the nation's leading scholars on not only vouchers, but I think educational equity. Their bios will be dropped in the chat. But I will give you very brief, abbreviated versions of their bios because otherwise we wouldn't have time to actually discuss vouchers. Professor Kevin Welner is based at the University of Colorado Boulder School of Education, where he specializes in education policy and law. He is also the co-founder and director of the National Education Policy Center, also housed at Colorado Boulder, which works to build bridges between the research world and the broader public. Professor Gary Orfield is a distinguished research professor of education law, political science, and urban planning at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is one of the co-founders and the director of the Harvard Civil Rights Project, and now serves as the co-director of the Civil Rights Project. And Luis Huerta, who is a professor of education and public policy at Teachers College at Columbia University, is also the chair of the education policy, and social analysis department. His research and scholarship focus on school choice reforms and school finance policy. And the book that they will be discussing, which they edited, examines a long-standing campaign that resulted in today's school voucher policies. Advocates of private school vouchers have promulgated this vision of service to low-income families, students of color, and other historically marginalized populations. They've been sold as a way to advance civil rights, but unfortunately, that has not actually been the case, and we'll discuss that more in detail today. And actually, just to begin our discussion, I will pose this question to all three of our esteemed panelists, and that is, first of all, can you define vouchers for us and also talk a little bit about their origins and how they shape contemporary policies in the U.S.? What do they look like now? How do they show up as policy now?
Let me get started. Thank you, Janelle, and welcome everyone. Let me get started with the answer, and I'll try to be quick and then defer to my colleagues. Let me start with the definition that we use. The idea of conventional vouchers were originally set up as a way to take tax money that comes into the state and provide it for tuition at private schools. And the mechanism was pretty simple. There was a voucher, like a credit that someone could take over to a private school, hand it over, essentially sign it over to the private school. This private school then cashes it in through the state funding. Then what happened is two things. One, the term voucher was focus grouped and poll tested and didn't come out very well. So we start to see all sorts of different names used. So we see things like scholarship instead of voucher. That's one difference. And the other is there are different mechanisms used to transfer that state money to the private school and now to homeschoolers. And so the mechanisms can get fairly arcane, but the basic idea that we look for, and so the two main different other types of mechanisms, one uses a tax credit so that a private individual who owes money to the state can essentially what they say donate, but there's sometimes no charity involved. Donate that money to a school tuition organization, which is a private nonprofit. The school tuition organization that packages those donations and hands them out in a voucher that looks much like the original conventional voucher approach. And then the donor is made whole by the state in terms of providing a tax credit that absolves the donor of owing that money to the state. And then what we're seeing most recently is something called education savings accounts, sometimes slightly different words used. But the idea there is that if someone agrees not to go not to send their kid to a public school, the state will provide them with a savings account that they could then use the money in for a variety of purposes, including tuition, but also in most of the states now, including homeschooling. And those expenses can, run the gamut. And in some places can not spend that money, save it up essentially, or save up some of that money and use it for college. So let me defer to the rest of the question to my colleagues.
That was very clear. Thanks, Kevin.
So I think the other questions were about the origins of vouchers. And Janel, do you want to?
Yes, Professor Orfield.
I'd just like to add something, which is that there's a tremendous confusion about these issues, and it's very intentional. And a lot of very conservative policies operate through the tax systems rather than through appropriations, which are much more visible. People don't understand that a tax credit is the same expenditure for the state in economic terms as a direct appropriation. It seems like something that shouldn't count at all. And that it's just something that's kind of returning a right to somebody not to pay their taxes. And people don't understand that that's just as costly in terms of a state budget as a direct voucher. The reason we call it a voucher is because people can understand that, and they need to understand that the costs are the same if they run through the tax system as through the appropriations process, but they're much less visible. So it's much easier to do something that is unpopular through the tax system than it is through the appropriations process.
And there are implications there both for regulation and for legal challenges, right? So there's a standing question in terms of taxpayer standing and challenging laws, and a couple decisions that have come down have essentially not allowed a legal challenge to a tax credit mechanism because nobody has standing. And then also advocates for vouchers have discovered that they're able to structure these laws with fewer regulations, less transparency, less accountability when they moved away from the conventional voucher approach. Luis?
So just to add a bit of more context on the history before we get into some of the more detailed questions. So I think it's important to just put the contemporary voucher history over the last 30 years, starting in about 1990 in Milwaukee in context. And over those 30 years, vouchers and tax credits and education savings accounts are today only serving about 750,000 kids. That's fewer than 1% of the total school population of the United States. Comparatively, public school choice programs like charter schools are now serving upwards of 4 million. One of the biggest contrasts, obviously, between the two programs is that one provides access to publicly funded schools, and that still are subject to accountability mechanisms, while private schools are not. But I think keeping that in mind as we start this discussion is really important, given the growth of these programs, but also just the proportion of kids that they're serving.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for that historic context. So the subtitle of your book is Exposing the Pretense of Equity. Okay, well, what have been the primary equity claims of those who advocate in favor of vouchers? And we often hear a lot of policymakers make arguments about who will benefit from vouchers, the populations of students who will benefit. Can you talk more about that as well? And why do you characterize those kind of claims, the equity claims, as pretense?
We'd like to start with that one.
Okay, we're going to pick someone. Let's see, Professor Orfield, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court, when it kind of authorized vouchers for religious schools, in the Zelman case, looked at the problem of poor kids in Cleveland, poor Black kids, not having choices. And they didn't really think about the possibility of choices in good public schools in the greater Cleveland area. They thought about the widespread assumption that private schools, by definition, are superior, and that offered a choice that was superior to public schools. It was simply an assumption. And I think that process was used in many places to say we should give poor kids an opportunity to have the kind of choices that middle-class kids have. But they didn't think that should include the choice to go to good suburban schools, for example, or a choice to go to good exam schools, which already existed. But they thought it should be a choice to go to a private school because private schools, by definition, were better, which was widespread understanding. And it seemed so simple to many of the advocates that it wasn't necessary to produce any actual evidence that was true, or to monitor what happened in the long term with these policies, which once, of course, you brought down the barrier between church and state funding, there were whole systems of existing private schools with parents that would like to have funding as well. And over time, the politics of this led to more and more expansion, less and less focus, and channeling of these resources to families that were already in private schools, and private religious schools mostly, and that wanted to have a subsidy that was being made available initially to help, in theory, disadvantaged students. But there were really no limits or controls to make sure that actually happened, and certainly no standards at all about the quality of the schools that would assure that they were actually as good as or better than the public schools that were already offered.
There's something we discussed throughout the book that you can think of as the foot in the door approach, in terms of how we've seen the growth of voucher policies throughout the U.S. Frequently we see voucher policies started fairly small in terms of numbers and also in terms of eligibility and who the program is targeted toward. Mm-hmm. So there are children who are perceived as more in need of options or more vulnerable. So it might be students in foster care, students who are experiencing homelessness, students who are children of people in the military, different categories. The most common is students with special needs. Students who are attending schools that have been rated D or F. Those different categories usually are used as programs just get started. And we're actually seeing a debate right now in Texas where the governor has been pushing for a universal plan and might end up getting through a plan that just target students with special needs as a foot in the door, right? I'll settle for that this year, and next year we'll come back and expand it. And that's what's largely happened throughout the US. So the equity claims are both about what vouchers can do, which Gary is getting at there, right? Like these are somehow going to be better opportunities, which we've seen empirically is not what's happening. We should talk about that. But also that they are targeting students who we as policymakers or as citizens think of as needing greater equity.
So, and just to build a bit on that, so one of our objectives in exposing this pretense of equity was also to go back to some of the original claims or intents of the advocates of promoting voucher programs, and two principal prongs that continue to be pushing this very seductive sell of promoting more private subsidy programs. The first is on the issue of access to quality schools, and that children that exit public schools and enter private schools are going to have this access to presumably better performing or higher quality schools. And the evidence has been fairly clear for the last 30 years, and it's become more crystal clear over the last 4 or 5 years, where we're now actually seeing studies in Indiana, Louisiana, and a few other states where we're seeing some fairly significant negative effects of kids who are exiting public and go into private schools with some of these subsidy programs, albeit the evidence that already existed, prior to that, albeit when voucher advocates were promoting selectively some of the positive results, but ignoring no general results that we were seeing. And the other prong of this is just the basic idea of market competition. And this continues again to be part of this idea that we're going to float the boat higher if kids are using choice and parents are voting with their feet, and bad schools or poor performing schools will close. This continues to resonate as two of the principal sort of calls by advocates, but with limited to no evidence that this is actually played out, especially with the competition effect, where we've seen almost no actual evidence to actually be able to trace that.
Thank you all so much. And I see that folks are using the Q&A function. I just want to flag that at the bottom of your screen, along the control bar, they look like, I don't know, those little cartoon bubbles where you can enter your questions for our panelists. And just given some points you all raised, more of a question about the structure, right? The structural impact of voucher policies. How have these policies resulted in more resources going to middle income or higher income families, and how have they deepened or entrenched inequities, some of which you have already addressed? I'll start with Luis this time. I'm going to mix it up.
We've clearly seen that as the private school landscape has expanded, it bears little resemblance to sort of the original sort of small niche policies from 3 decades ago, starting in the 90s, that were very much targeted to kids that were either low income or failing schools. And the changes over time, there's evidence that the success of sort of legal and policy strategies that advocate for more voucher laws with fewer regulations are also now broadening eligibility for recipients. So just as an example, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program, which is the first program in 1990 in the contemporary voucher history, that included a fairly robust means-tested income eligibility threshold that limited participation to families with annual incomes of 175% above the poverty level. Today, that has expanded to almost twice that, to 300% of the federal poverty level. We also see that means tested has eroded in states like Indiana and a few other places. In Indiana, expansion has gone from 150% of the free and reduced price lunch to 300%. Florida has risen to about 375% of the poverty level. So we're seeing these eligibility thresholds change, and they're ranging today from what is the equivalent of about $43K at the low end, and at the high ceiling at about $104K as an annual salary for the ceiling of eligibility. We've also seen the erosion of eligibility around sort of some of the program mechanisms that initially, for example, promise tuition in lieu of any additional charges. And we now see many of the voucher programs that only provide a partial voucher as opposed to some of the eligibility charges. And then lastly, on accountability, we've seen an increase in the number of voucher programs that actually require testing or that have testing requirements. However, these are very soft testing requirements that really have no teeth to them with regards to holding any private school accountable. And it's important to remember that there is no state that has strong accountability rules of any private school.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Welner, and then I'll turn it to Professor Orfield. How are vouchers impacting resources, and how are they impacting equity or inequities?
So, wow, that's a lot there. So I want to build in part on the last point that Luis made about accountability, which I think gets at least partly to your question, Janel. I mean, students learn when they have opportunities to learn, and slapping a name on a school as public, private, charter doesn't really affect that directly, right? So if you have a school that's providing really rich opportunities to learn, and some independent private schools absolutely do that. Really rich opportunities to learn and really rich tuition. So that's the key, right? If you're talking about sort of the question of it's sort of the more neoliberal question, right? An individual level, how are vouchers playing out? I would stress issues of opportunity to learn, and this might be a good point to talk about the studies that Luis was just discussing. At least to drill down a little bit more, which is that what we're seeing in these recent studies, 6 different studies from 4 different jurisdictions, is particularly math results. We're seeing devastating outcomes. In some states, we're seeing outcomes that show worse outcomes. You know, if someone receives a voucher, worse results than what we saw in terms of the impact of Hurricane Katrina or the pandemic, right? So these are really negative outcomes in terms of math, right? In reading, we're seeing some negative, but not anywhere near as bad as with math. And what we're seeing also, and this is really important to stress, if you look at the entire body of voucher research going back decades, what we're seeing is that the studies of the bigger voucher plans and the more recent studies, in other words, the studies of what's happening with vouchers recently, the bigger we're looking at in terms of the plan and the more recent, the worse the results. So when people cherry pick on an older study, they're talking about generally smaller studies, and they're talking about a different context. So that's one thing. And the other gets to this accountability issue that I really think is important for us to understand as state legislatures push for these policies. And those in the audience, I know there were some questions that popping up about how to respond to these policies. There's a really cynical, I would argue, hypocritical argument that you may hear about some of these awful outcomes for vouchers in recent studies. And that's that the state laws requiring that vouchered students take the state tests, that those state laws, by requiring the tests, discourage the better private schools from participating. So therefore, the results that we see are much lower than would be likely occurring in the voucher states that don't require testing. Essentially, the act of measuring means that the measurement will be lower, is the argument. So apparently what we should do is keep adopting and expanding voucher policies, but set aside outcome data and evaluations, and instead just trust that they're doing great. And that's in fact the way that voucher advocates have structured the vast majority of their voucher laws. There's very little transparency or accountability, not just about students' test score outcomes, but also about whether the voucher accepting students have transferred from public schools or are merely private school families happily accepting the new taxpayer subsidy. In the new ESA programs, it would be nice to know a lot more about how, for example, homeschooling families are spending their new taxpayer subsidies. Other transparency issues involve access to the schools, who's being turned away. as well as issues of curriculum and instruction. Some of you might remember the neo-Nazi homeschooling group profiled in various news outlets about a year ago called Dissident Homeschoolers. How are states preventing taxpayer money from funding education? Really, that's little more than racist propaganda. And would today's courts even allow the states to prevent ESA money from going to avowedly racist homeschoolers in private schools? So there are a lot of interesting questions here that we can't answer, in part because the data intentionally is not being collected. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, thank you for underscoring that lack of transparency. I will hand it over to Professor Orfield before we go to our next question. And folks are really using this chat. So Professor Orfield, do you have anything to add to what your co-editors underscored about resources and equity?
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple points. One, the first is that the places that are doing this are the places that cut their taxes, that don't fund education very well, and that have a general anti-public school orientation that really comes out of the Reagan administration beginning to undermine the whole confidence in public schools and to blame the teachers and the schools for the failure of very poor students in highly segregated schools. But these are states that don't fund public schools decently, don't fund teachers decently, and aren't about to create additional resources in the public sector, spending a lot of public sector money on this exercise. And so it's important to think about the fungibility of money. When you take this money out of a state budget, either through the tax system or appropriations, do you replace it? You don't in most of these states. So you diminish the resources that can be used for public education, which has to serve all children. The second point I'd like to make is a lot of the difficulties of this is that the voucher programs don't use the equity provisions that we found to be necessary in public school choice programs, particularly magnet schools. The magnet schools worked most equitably when we had free transportation. The vouchers don't provide that. That means that, for example, in the DC study in our book, Congress has insisted on vouchers for DC whenever the Republicans have controlled it, but they haven't provided any transportation. So the DC kids end up, and the Black kids who live in Anacostia or really poor communities end up with whatever private school might exist there. It might be set up by some kind of storefront church or something else. They don't have access to the quality schools in Northwest Washington or other parts of the city where there are really good private schools. And there doesn't have enough money in it to afford tuition. But and what we learned in the magnet school experience was you have to have good information to parents and fair recruitment to give them some knowledge of whether their choices are worth making. And you have to provide transportation, and you have to provide some kind of quality process to make sure that the choices are worthwhile and distinctive. And none of those things exist in the voucher program. So there may be some very good private schools, private religious schools in some sector of a city, but the students can't get to them if they can't provide their own transportation. They may not know about them. They may think, like much of the public does, that anything that's private is going to be better. But what they're being offered is really even worse. And it's a segregated high poverty school without any professional quality measures at all. And that's not, that on its face, anybody who thinks seriously about schooling, that's an inferior school on many dimensions. And the fact that it's called private doesn't assure anything to the students who make those choices. And usually there's almost no information. And then, of course, the schools get to recruit or select or refuse to enroll students on their own, since it's really the schools that choose more than the parents in many cases. And they tend to give preference to people who are already connected in terms of For example, really good quality, high standards religious schools, and sometimes provide supplements to them for their own parishioners, for example. So it's a process in which the choice system doesn't meet any of the equity standards that are necessary for a choice system that has any probability of providing equal outcomes.
Right, right. And thank you so much, Professor Orfield. And that really underscores like what choice are parents making, right? Whose choice is it? First of all, to your point about are the schools choosing or are the parents choosing? And if it's a choice that in which parents are making without full transparency or all the information they need, unfortunately, it's not a fully informed choice that they're able to make. I want to just before we're not officially at the Q&A yet, folks. We'll get to that in a couple minutes. But I do want to just take a couple of steps back because in the Q&A, Leanne King asked a question that I think is important. We're talking about, or we've said, choice advocates or people, policymakers supporting choice. And she asked, who are they? Who are these advocates supporting vouchers, right? Who constitutes the they? In your book, you talk about how a lot of conservative policymakers have backed vouchers. But Professor Orfield, you've also talked about how a lot of families, unfortunately, if they don't have comprehensive education, may be advocating and supportive, think these are great options, right, for children. So who are those who are advocating for vouchers?
Gary, do you want to start?
Well, it's a mixed group. There are people who are ideologically committed to this, that come out of the Friedman conservative ideology. There are people who are simply anti-public school. There are people who are running private religious schools that can't finance themselves, that really are desperately looking for public resources. And I understand that. I'm Catholic myself. I know Catholic schools struggle, even the good ones in many cases. They're looking for public resources. So it's a mixture of many things. But there's also very organized national campaigns that are put together by conservative public action groups that do model statutes and that support this effort across the country. So it's not a conspiracy. It's a coalition of organizations that work together and appeal strongly to the conservative caucuses and state legislatures. This is rarely done, out by a referendum, which have usually been defeated. It's done in a way that very few people understand, and there are lots of efforts to do this collaboration across states by public interest groups.
Luis, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so one of the primary funders has been organizations like ALEC, which is funded mostly from Koch brothers money, and they have been very instrumental in funding a lot of the legislative efforts, not so much in the background anymore, but actually being quite forward and out in the open. I was actually stunned to learn just recently that over the last couple of years, there have been over 130 education savings accounts legislation proposed across many states. This is still a fairly nascent sort of model and evolution of, from vouchers to tax credits and now education savings accounts, which have a more universal eligibility mechanism. But to see that level, that sort of fervor of legislative activity in the very recent years is quite stunning, because the advocates really are sort of promoting this, and it's also important to sort of approach this with caution, because the education savings accounts are very much, in most cases, opening up eligibility to anyone and erasing all eligibility mechanisms in some states, and the costs that states are bearing as a result are astronomical. There's been recent reports that in Arizona, when the ESA they're expanded, that the cost to state is going to be somewhere in the $1.5 billion range. It's also important to note that as we go towards education savings accounts, which have expanded eligibility, that we are seeing evidence now that upwards of 75 to almost 80% of the kids who are participating in these programs were previously not enrolled in public schools. These were kids who had either never enrolled in public schools or started in kindergarten, or were already in private schools, which the state was not bearing the cost of, but now have to do so under these programs.
Janelle, one thing I would add to what Gary and Louise said is that I think there's been a historical shift in terms of who the they might be. Back in the days when Milwaukee and Cleveland started their programs, and what we're seeing over the last several years. And I think it was easier to make this argument, or clearer to make this argument, when Betsy DeVos was this very prominent advocate, right? It was very clear this was a push from people who didn't have a lot of love for public schools. And what we've seen over the last several years, when we look more closely, is that support for vouchers has become a requirement of being a good Republican in a state legislature. And we're seeing the pressure right now exerted in Texas is a great example of this. So rural Republican legislators in very red states have long been opposed to voucher plans. Public schools in rural areas tend to be the center of the community, and there's a lot of support for them, and there wasn't a lot of desire to undermine the public school system. But that has shifted. What's shifted is sort of the traditional Republican, particularly rural Republican, desire to help their public schools and to be fiscally responsible and to require accountability for public money, and shifting toward I'm a Republican, so I have to support this free market reform or this deregulatory reform or this reform that my party leaders are telling me to support.
It's important for people to kind of recognize that what's really happening over time is a decision to end the separation between church and state, and to fund predominantly middle-class families that choose to have religious education. And that's not how it is ever proposed. But that's a practical consequence in the long run in many places.
Well, Professor Orfield, that's an important point. And I see a question. We're not a Q&A yet, but we're going to get there, I promise. But this does align with the last question by Fritz Mulhauser related to public and religious schools. So in your final chapter of your book, you note how many countries like England, Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, and Spain provide taxpayer support to church-run schools. Can you talk, though, how are those systems different from our public education system, and what can folks take away from those differences?
So the main thing, to be really short, is that those are highly regulated, right? So everything from the curriculum to the rules about hiring of teachers tends to be dictated to the private schools, church-run private schools in those countries. And so that is anathema to the backers of vouchers in this country. Advocates of vouchers in this country have pushed very strongly for a highly deregulated, non-transparent, government hands-off, hand us the money, leave it on a paper bag on our porch, and disappear, and it's ours, right? That is a very different model than a model that says we are incorporating a system of schools that have been run by churches for centuries into our public school system. But if you want to play our game, these are the rules, right? These are the rules you have to abide by. And so experiencing, I mean, there is there's religious teaching in those schools. But it's, because a lot of these countries have church, official churches. But and actually, I should point out, in these countries now, that religious teaching can vary by which religious institution is running the school. But the basic structure is just very different.
One of the things that's interesting is that in many of these countries also collect a tax that funds the churches directly, not just the schools. So it's a totally different kind of relationship. And a point that I would make is it hasn't been very good for the religious life in these countries. These are countries where there's been a radical decline in church membership. So if you're thinking about it, and of course there is much more regulation. There's a precept in public administration that there's the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. Eventually, if these institutions become publicly financed, in essence, through a voucher system, they will be subject to regulation as scandals occur and so forth. And that will undermine the independence of the church groups, which is reason why some religious groups in the United States traditionally have been very strongly advocates of church-state separation.
The other thing to add really quickly is anti-discrimination rules. And anti-discrimination rules apply to those church-run schools. And there's a big battle brewing in this country about whether church-run schools can use the free exercise clause to exempt themselves from anti-discrimination civil rights rules.
Absolutely. Thank you all. So we will be transitioning to Q&A. I want to flag for folks, math is not my strong suit. That's why I'm a law professor, but I know enough math to know we will not get through all the questions. So we'll try to answer the top line questions here, particularly those along some of the same theme. So I will ask this question posed actually by the Education Law Center's President Robert Kim. Thank you so much for joining us and for having this webinar. And one thing is, and this is a little bit reflective just about the book, what surprised you as you reflect upon the work of your contributing authors to your new book? And what is one way that your book can be used, and I will love this to be able to tell my students this, to convince a legislator or a court that vouchers are bad for underserved communities? So the first, anything that surprised you about the work as you think about the work of the contributing authors? Let's start with that one.
So Janel, I'm going to start with the second one if that's okay, because and I think the three of us who edited this volume, we've in our own role as professors, we've also been always great about public engagement, and we're committed to that as we're doing today. And I think that one of the things that is unique about this text is, as compared to so many of the journal articles and other research over the last 25 or so years on the voucher issue, is that we focus very little on the achievement issue. And it's mostly because, for the most part, we feel that that's actually quite conclusive now. And there is one chapter that does focus a lot on that. But our objective here was really to talk about some of these other effects that seldom reach sort of that public discourse, these issues around civil rights and access and potential negative effects for special ed kids and other kids. And I think that's our effort to sort of switch the narrative a bit here, because so many policymakers only want to focus on that bottom line of whether there are positive net achievement of student achievement effects. But when we start to outline and expose all the other potential effects that vouchers might have on kids, it's really about sort of trying to emphasize those and place those as in similar priority with the issue around around student achievement effects.
There's another issue related to what Luis is talking about, and I will answer the first part of your question too, because I do have an answer to that. But and that's that school choice more broadly. So this, we could be talking about completely public school choice here. We need to be really careful. There's an obstacle that's laden in every school choice policy, and that's about allocating kids opportunities to learn based on the ability of the kid's parent or guardian to work a system, right? And the ideal with a public school system is that every public school is going to provide every kid with great opportunities to learn, and we have a long way to go to get to that point. But at least as designed, neighborhood public schools are not designed to tie a kid's educational opportunities to the ability of the kid's parent or guardian to work the system. And anytime we're talking about a school choice system, we need to be keeping that foremost in our mind. How are we going to avoid that obstacle? Because it's such an inequitable obstacle. It's such a stratifying obstacle. So that's just sort of a side note tied to what Luis was saying. My answer to your question is I was surprised in diving into this by how little evidence matters. And it gets to, I think it overlaps with what Luis is saying, but the more we've seen these divergent lines, we're seeing stronger and stronger evidence of very negative outcomes and more growth of voucher policies. Right. And that's not the way we want our policy making to work. We want our policymakers to be paying attention to the evidence. And, so in theory, as the evidence of vouchers comes in and shows such negative impact, particularly again, regarding math, we should be seeing policymakers backing away from the policies, or at least coming up with ways to make the systems different, more effective, more accountable. And we're not. We're seeing the exact opposite.
I have a couple of points on the public dimension of this. One of them is, in my experience, African American and Latino caucuses in state legislatures don't have staffs that are research oriented, and they don't get very good information. And I think that one of the things that advocates really need to do is to take things like what we've done in this book and break it down and communicate it with those staffs and help people understand what's going on. I think it's very important for researchers at individual universities and individual states to take close looks at these issues and to encourage people in the education press to look at them, create seminars and so forth, because so much of our policymaking is state level. And so many of our communications mechanisms, the impoverished newspapers and media, don't communicate any significant information. So it seems to me organizing state level information research projects and communicating them with the people who need it and with the press that will publish it, doesn't have any capacity to do independent research, is really important work, because most people in a small state don't care and don't read national research. So what we've done is a step, but that needs to be localized and needs to be texturized, and it needs to be communicated with the people who need it and are in positions to stop really dangerous policies, which come with a delicious coding of possible wonders that need to be examined, and they need to be examined in a local and state context.
Thank you for that. But I will say one thing, though, as a former staffer, I do think that staffers have this research. They have the information for Black policymakers, right? Bobby Scott on Capitol Hill, I've worked with his staff in various capacities about this research. I wonder if the research is not always palatable or accessible, right? And by that, I mean, and I tell my students, this doesn't mean you dumb down, if you will, research at all. It just means, does it make sense? Is it resonating with people's everyday lives, right? And this is one thing I think that some of the folks in favor of vouchers and charters have mastered is communication. Our seminar tonight actually is about communicating. And we're having folks come in and talk to my students about this because I tell them that, in my clinic where we're talking about these issues of whether it's school finance, whether it's privatization or vouchers, we have to be able to talk about these things, and they're law students, right? Don't use a bunch of like legalese or technical language to show how smart you are. This is about communicating these issues in ways that resonate with people's everyday lives, right? And I think that that's so important, right? I am actually going to slip in a question from one of my students who will get extra credit. No, I'm kidding, Ambriana. She's a parent, though, and I want to bring in this point about parental rights because a couple of other folks have asked this. Ambriana Arnea says, is the solution then to push equity and regulation within private schools? Or is it to shift to parental preference to magnet schools and public schools, right? And also underscoring still about almost 90% of our nation's children are in traditional public schools still, right? So is that the answer then?
Let me just say a couple things. One of them is these private schools are political forces into themselves, and they have a lot of people who are really invested in finding resources for them. So they're not going to just sit there and let themselves be regulated easily. And the same people who favor vouchers don't favor regulating anything. So pursuing the course of regulating these schools is going to be tough. In terms of the options, my strong preference is to offer better choice opportunities within public schools, particularly better magnet schools that do have the equity policies that good magnet schools had, which are transportation, information, and quality of curriculum. Those are the kinds of options that are really valuable and that do make a difference. And that we're losing those in the magnet schools that we still have that serve 2 million students plus right now. We should focus a lot of attention on that if we're thinking about parent choices. Those are good choices if they're done properly, and much more equitable choices and more accountable choices.
So, Janel, I think
Yes,
the
please.
process of, or the attempt to regulate private schools, whether that's testing requirements, hiring certified teachers, instructional minutes, instructional time, curriculum, all these other factors that traditional public schools have to be accountable for, is a fool's errand, simply because in the context of vouchers and other private subsidy programs, because most of these private schools will just retreat, as Gary indicated, and they will just retreat and stop accepting some of these kids. And I think that it's important to remember that fewer than 10% of kids are in private schools nationwide. And it's not to discount that we should also care for those kids that are in those schools, but 90% of kids are in publicly funded schools. And I think that is where the greatest efforts should be, especially when we know that private schools will resist regulation, actively reject kids based on whether it's special needs or race or language issues and so forth. So our efforts, I think, really should be about focusing on how do we further improve the quality of public schools, given the vast number of kids that are in those types of schools.
It makes me think of an experience I had during the desegregation days in a southern state, where I talked to the state commissioner of education. He said, I made a speech the other day saying you could open a private school and it's stable. And we couldn't do anything about it. And somebody called me up the next morning and said, oh, well, so that had already been done in his area.
I almost said unbelievable, but it is believable. Okay, I'm going to ask this question from Lori Kirkpatrick, and Professor Welner, you mentioned a bill in Texas. She notes in Texas, we're currently in special session with the governor demanding that a voucher bill pass before giving teacher raises or raising the per pupil funding for public schools. Have you seen this tactic used in other states to achieve passing a voucher bill? And I flag this question because we haven't actually talked much about teachers too, right? And where they are falling in this whole discussion.
Yeah. So first of all, I should say my internet connection has been unstable. So if I stop, just turn it over to one of the other two. Yes, I have. I'm remembering in Pennsylvania, the education EITC, the tax credit voucher there. I know that they tied funding to expanding that. In Utah, there was a successful changing, I believe, of even the state constitution, but certainly a trading off of funding public schools with in order to gain the voucher claim. And it's happened. I mean, those are just two off the top of my head. But yes, I mean, in Illinois, maintaining the Republican support to fund schools, I believe, was to pass budgetary requests from Democrats was tied to the voucher plan is another one. So there have been plenty of, just off the top of my head, those are three, but those are not the only three. And that's part of our legislative process, right? You horse trade. It's problematic in my mind to hold public education funding hostage in that way, even in a context of legislative horse trading. But yes, that's certainly part of what we've seen.
Thank you all so much. I will ask you each to take, I don't know, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Last words about vouchers and their importance for public education, starting with Professor Orfield.
Well, I think that if you look carefully at what we've reported in this book, you realize that we're talking about an ideological movement that's detached from the reality of actual educational opportunities or outcomes. And that it's very important that as states do this and create a new interest group, which will perpetuate itself, as all public interest groups do, as they begin to draw on public funding. Before you do that, you need to think seriously about what we actually know about this. It turns out we know a lot, and that none of the basic dreams and hopes are realized. There are, and it's not that there aren't parents who deserve better choices,
Right.
but we really do need to shift the discussion back to how we provide those choices in an equitable and educationally accountable way within public schools where the vast majority of our students are located, and not divert scarce resources, especially in what I call the cheap states that don't want to fund anything very well, take from their poorly funded public school budgets and aid private families from upper middle class that are in religious schools. It makes no sense.
Thank you, Professor Orfield. Professor Huerta. I think
you're muted, please.
Sorry, folks. I'll use my closing remarks to sort of address what I was looking through the Q&A, and I see that one of the primary questions that continue to come up is how can we sort of counter this advocacy of vouchers? And I just want to say, continue to use us as resources, and colleagues at National Education Policy Center, colleagues at the Education Law Center, and the organizations that are sponsoring this. We are all academics that are engaged in this, in sort of public engagement and trying to disseminate this information. And we're all willing to assist in engaging with policymakers or work with groups in how to make this sort of research accessible to a broader audience.
Thank you. And Professor Welner, thank you so much.
Yeah, just very briefly, one of the things we haven't discussed much is the role of public schools or shared public schooling within as a core democratic institution. The arguments focused on individual choice and the potential for individual families to benefit or be harmed by a voucher system is certainly an.
Okay, I think that was a connection issue that Professor Welner had mentioned. Thank you all so much for joining us. The book is The School Voucher Illusion that is published by Teachers College Press through Columbia's Teachers University. Thank you all so much for your engagement, for the excellent questions. We really appreciate this. The recording of this will be sent to all registrants. So to address a couple of questions about that, that came up in the chat as well. Thank you all so much. I will hand it back to Jessica Levin, and thank you, Jessica.
Thank you, Professor George, so much for moderating that tremendous discussion. We can never get to all the great questions from the audience, though you made a superb effort and got through so many of them and offered so many great thoughts. We encourage you all to contact Public Funds Public Schools at info@pfps.org if you have remaining questions or are seeking assistance in your state. I also want to thank Education Law Center's Caitlin Comasanias, Wendy Lecker, and Sharon Kringle for helping with this event behind the scenes. And thank you to, again, our wonderful moderator, Professor Janel George, and our fantastic panelists, Professors Kevin Welner, Luis Huerta, and Gary Orfield. Don't forget, again, that you can use the PFPS code for a discount on their new edited volume, The School Voucher Illusion, and there's a link in the chat. And finally, thank you to our audience for joining us again today for this event in the Public Funds Public Schools webinar series. There will be a recording available, as Professor George said, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care.